So I tried building a Leona deck with I tried building a Daybreak version. I looked at it and I was like, okay, you could run Ravenous Flock in this. Ravenous Flock is pretty nice with Solari Sunhawk, and yeah, I mean, Noxus has some decent cards. The biggest problem is that, you know, we have to start by looking at what the deck needs, right? Like, the second region, if that's the choice, you know, what cards you're adding is always like a function of like what the archetype is lacking. And when we look at Daybreak, it's lacking a few pretty specific things, right? Like, it's lacking, when you just look at the Daybreak cards, when it's just Targon cards, you're lacking fast responses to things and disruption. So ways of shutting down your opponent's strategy on the stack, and ways of like countering open attacks, or potentially making an open attack feel slightly less bad if you're forced into an open attack, because Daybreak is an archetype that usually can't open attack. And when we look at like what this archetype needs, you know, we're looking at fast speed punishers. We're looking at, you know, ways of being able to close out the game. Maybe ways of being able to keep our units alive from some stuff. It's just like Demacia has everything. Most importantly, single combat is, you know, a really important tool here, for a lot of reasons. It's an anti-aggro tool, especially with Sunforger with the lifesteal. It's a fast speed response, which is super powerful, and it's a disruption tool. Disruption and fast speed response are two different things. That's important to understand in deck building, because a fast speed response can be like a flash freeze, but flash freeze only disrupts certain kinds of strategies, right? Like, it's important to be able to just respond to something on the stack, and single combat does a pretty good job of doing that. And that's one of Targon's biggest weaknesses as a region, that they don't really have fast things. Like, Targon has everything except for powerful fast things, which is part of the reason why Hush is so good, and part of the reason why Star Shaping is so good, because of course against aggro, you know, you can respond to an open attack with a Star Shaping, and they're in region. But the second region still needs to help accentuate those, especially for something like this where I want to be the aggressor and I don't want to use Hush or Star Shaping, right? So the problem with Ravenous Flock is, I mean, Flock has synergy. You know, you can look at Flock and you're like, oh, and if I stun them, I can deal 4 damage to them, which is pretty cute, but it's like, it's the wrong kind of synergy, right? It's, at the end of the day, it doesn't really help the things that you need. It's just making your deck have a bit higher, like, interconnected value, and it's not really, like, getting fleshed out, right? Which is, I think really, really important. So, I mean, there's a couple other options, and there's different ways of doing it. You know, if you were in Noxus, it would be kind of interesting, but you could certainly be in Whirling Death. Whirling Death might actually be the answer. I mean, the card is pretty cute. I think it's gone underrated from time to time. Like, it's all right. It's not as good as single combat for this kind of deck, but access to Flock is nice, and Noxus does have a couple of other cards. But yeah, I think it's just important to look at deck building as like this idea of problem solving. Like, okay, so I've got, because deck building is about combining 2 or 3 different reagents together to create something that's larger than the sum of its whole, right? So whatever your concept is, you're always starting with one reagent, and you're thinking to yourself, okay, so I want to build a Daybreak deck. What does a Daybreak deck need? Like, what would make this deck function better, and how can I get it? And you can have a lot of different answers to that, but it's important to think in that way, because otherwise just like jamming in cards that seem good together but don't help each other isn't really good. Even though Daybreak has stuns, Flock is going to be quite clunky because the stuns aren't controlled, and Daybreak has a hard time doing chip damage. Exactly, it also has a hard time doing chip damage. One thing, by the way, an interesting answer to that question, if you have played Daybreak decks like this before, and you want to think, okay, what does Daybreak decks really need? There's an interesting consideration. You can basically realize that Daybreak decks are kind of garbage when you don't have Ravoon. And I thought about like trying to run like a Babbling Bjerg version of Daybreak, which is like interesting, but maybe a little too edgy. And the real question is like, okay, you've got this idea for Bjerg. Here's the difference, right? I think a lot of people would look at this intersection. They'd be like, okay, well, you've got this Daybreak. How good is Babbling Bjerg in Daybreak? And a lot of you guys might look at this and be like, Bjerg's not that good. Daybreak has a lot of 4-drops. You'd have to cut Sunforger if you wanted it to pull you Ravoon every time. And in addition to that, you know, if you don't cut Sunforger, then it's also like clogging up the 4-drop slot. And that's maybe decent arguments. Like, those arguments are fine. But the important next step isn't to actually really think too much about what Bjerg is doing, is to ask ourselves, what else does Freljord provide us? The regions are everything. The regions are literally everything. Like, the cards don't matter nearly as much as the regions, right? So, like, what's the benefits or the cost of being in Bjerg? Like, does Bjerg supplement or replace some of these Demacia tools in some way? And, I mean, Troll Chant is definitely really nice. Like, that's great, because it helps with the open attack. It helps with some amount of aggression, and, you know, it helps play, like, a little bit reactively. We can disrupt some kinds of stuff. But that's kind of about it, right? That's like Freljord, I wouldn't say provides like a ton of cards for what the strategy needs. Another thing, by the way, you might identify is you might say Daybreak needs a powerful 3-drop. That's a very strong argument. Some people are running Solari Priestess in Daybreak, and it's maybe not bad, but I think the reason they're running Solari Priestess is literally because it says the word Daybreak on it, which, I mean, I wouldn't 3-of this card at least. It's like, that's not really how we deck builds. It's not inconsiderable, but I think too many people default to it and feel like I have to run all the Daybreak cards. So yeah, Solari Priestess isn't really a good 3-drop. You want from your second region something that might be able to be a nice tempo turn 3 play, right? Because Targon doesn't really have that. So that's definitely something you could be like, this second region might want to help fulfill a nice turn 3 play, right? Because it's a tempo deck. We do want to smash down on tempo. Draven from Noxus is good at doing that. So that's a bonus for the Noxus, right? But what I've effectively decided on throughout everything is that when you look at, you know, Leona and Lucian, well, we have a pretty good 3-drop. I mean, we could use a second champion slot. That's another thing that we could use. You're not forced into using You're not forced into using all your champion slots, but it can be nice sometimes because some champions are pretty good. I think Lucian is playing at a good speed for this deck, and Senna being like a power 3 is fine. You know, Lucian and Senna are actually all right together. And, you know, we have, of course, decent ways of being able to protect 2 health stat lines with access to Ranger's Resolve and Pale Cascade. So something like that. And again, Demacia, I think, is just too hard to escape in this deck build because we're running, you know, single combat and relentless pursuit fixed. They almost uniquely fix in. It's a really, really hard way to replace these. 2 of the biggest problems that Daybreak has as an archetype. You know, we need pursuit to be able to close out games, and to capitalize off of like single turn effects like stuns maybe. And single combat is that disruption tool that can, you know, punish open attack that also works as anti-aggro, which is really, really important. Like when you play, you know, so, you know, you play Solari Sunforger, you attack with Sunforger and they like block into Fervor and you single combat, you have basically won the game in a way that it's really hard for other cards to do. You might say Whirling Death, but even then, in that situation, it's extremely common for you to have 2 mana instead of 3. Like, incredibly common. So, single combat solves a lot of problems of this archetype at once, and not in a way that can be easily replaced. Lucian and Senna fill the missing champ and the missing 3-drop, and everything all works together. The entire point of Daybreak is that your units don't die, though. Oh, are you referring to like the Ranger's Resolve? Yeah, I mean, depending on the meta, I know some people have like cut down on some protection tools in this deck, but you're still getting good value. Also, Zenith Blade with Lucian and Senna sometimes matters. 2 Zenith Blade is also a really great ratio. You're pretty much never playing 3 of it, but it's kind of nice to have the second one for free sometimes. You never want to double draw this card really, but you know, having access to a second one that you draw off of the first one is fine. So I really like 2 Zenith Blade in this deck. I know, like, I think a lot of people look at Zenith Blade and they think to themselves, again, it's that like superficial or like text-based mentality of synergy, but a lot of people look at this card and they don't want to run this as not a 3 of, because it's like, well, I need to just play all the Zenith Blades. And that might be true in Lee Sin, maybe, but for the most part, in like, if your deck is trying to play a little bit faster, like, when you play it out in your head, how often are you actually playing all 3 Zenith Blades? Outside of Lee Sin, not often. You're playing 2 a decent amount of the times, but, you know, play the games out. Double drawing Zenith Blade feels bad, even in Lee Sin, in a lot of cases. And it's just like, it's a very solid 2 of. The fact that it says the word Daybreak on it is kind of nice. That's another problem with Eye of the Rahorek, because in this deck build, we can look at Eye, and I just don't think fits this deck at all. It's got the same problem as Solari Priestess, which is that it's not playing at the speed this deck wants. Like, it says the word Daybreak on it, and it says the word Stun on it, but it's not doing what this deck wants, right? Like, deck building is a lot more complicated than just, like, what the words say, right? You have to think about how the game is going to be playing out. And I want it to fit Eye. I don't think it would be the worst thing ever, but I don't think it really solves a problem with this deck. It's pretty slow, and I don't know. It's a weird card to evaluate. I might be underrating it, but it's just kind of redundant with a lot of like your curve plans, right? Rahorek's board space issues seems under-discussed as a 5-drop. Yeah, that's true, because it also takes 2 board slots, which will... Yeah. No, you're right. That's very under-discussed. 100%. Like, that'll happen in a decent amount of cases, especially in a Daybreak deck. Like, Eye of the Rahorek is trying to bind like 3 different synergies together, right? Because it's like Daybreak and Landmark and Stun. But like, Landmark and Stun, you know, in those kinds of decks in Ionia and Targon Landmarks, like, I might be fine with losing a bit of board space. In Daybreak especially, like, losing the board space is like really, really bad. Deck 100% can't run it. Yeah, there's literally no chance. It's actually kind of impossible. But yeah, basically, I guess to summarize, like, a lot of people's concept of deck building is like, they're just, you know, they're imagining the best case scenario, or they're imagining a specific 2-card combo, or they're imagining a 3-card combo, right? They're just like, you know, a lot of people want to just put in 10 cards and then just like auto, and then the other 30 don't matter. But the thing about deck building is it all has to work together, right? So it's not about the payoff. Like, always people look at, you know, like how the interactions between the cards are going to work, right? Like, you know, people are thinking, for example, you know, people are like, well, what if we ran Swain Zillion, because, you know, Zillion is, you know, can kind of wipe the deal a lot of damage with time bombs, which helps Swain level up. It helps Swain's like damage conditions with like flock and stuff. And the problem begins when you like start to like, you know, look at the greater picture, because it's not about like specific interactions. It's about, okay, it's about the sub-layered interactions, right? Which is to say, like, look at the cards that are working. The cards that are working well with Zillion need to work well with the cards that are working well with Swain. You know what I'm saying? Like, the entire deck all needs to be interconnected. You don't want just like a flimsy chain of connected synergies. You want your connected synergies to be like a web, where like everything is interconnected with each other. And that's the most important step that people skip. They don't really look at like the region or the cards, but it's everything to do with the region or the cards, everything. And that's why, like, you know, when I was talking about the Bjerg thing, it's not about how good Bjerg is in this deck. Maybe Bjerg is good, but if Freljord doesn't work for the deck, then Bjerg is bad. If Freljord has other tools that help, then Bjerg might be fine, right? It's not really about the card itself. It's about the context that the card brings to your deck, more so than anything.